For many of us, migration is defined as a threat and disadvantage. Africa is free of colonialism and severely constrained by neocolonialism and by its failure to derive positive value from democracy and freedom. Africa is a very wealthy continent, and yet it is drowning from poverty and is occupied by agile citizens who desire prosperity and who are struggling to combat severe poverty. So these are the constraints in which we have to give effect to the dictates of the Refugee Convention. The reality of poverty makes it difficult to be generous and humane. This is glaringly obvious in the treatment of African migrants in African countries and the xenophobic targeting Africans attract whenever economic challenges in our countries arise. Migrants have become scapegoats for governance failures, for local community neglect of laws and regulations, and ignorance and self-hatred occasioned by prejudice, racism, and fear. Also, a serious decline in Pan-African ideals has added to the hostile reactions. So, everybody in South Africa often refers, says, oh, we practice Ubuntu. But the minute it comes to migrants, Ubuntu seems to fall away. Everybody makes reference to what is a wonderful, humane concept. But when its practice is related to attitude toward those who come from elsewhere, especially blacks who come from elsewhere, then the whole attitude, Ubuntu, falls away. And this is a problem that we have to give some attention to. Furthermore, despite strenuous attempts at defining and implementing a robust agenda of continental unity, I think sovereign priority still trumps African policy action. What I mean by that, sometimes I write and then I show my husband what I've written and he says, what are you talking about? So let me explain. What I mean by that is that whenever we are faced with the objective of seeking to achieve African integration, African unity, conjoined policy action, we resort to sovereignty and not wanting a Pan-African set of actions. And often the attempt at integration and unity is defeated by sovereign priority. And it's something our leaders, particularly in the context of the African Union, need to think about, especially since we have appropriated and agreed to Agenda 2063, which has its basis and foundation as African unity. Take the example of our own country, South Africa. Migrants are blamed for crime, and there are some who do commit crime, but they are blamed for all crime, blamed for unemployment, blamed even for inadequate school places. We know our population has been growing faster than the growth of GDP, but are we building schools at the same level or pace? And yet, when there are inadequate school places, we focus on children from other parts of Africa. This attitude is especially worrying in South Africa, as our country has a very progressive constitution that enshrines human dignity and equality. It is perhaps our failure to provide expansive education on the core ideals of our Constitution that has allowed for the emergence of the deep levels of anti-migrant antipathy we witness today. I think increased attention to our history, its impact, and our constitutional values and principles could help avoid some of the excessive migrant hostility witnessed frequently. Sometimes it's not cruel anger, it is ignorance. And we need to do more about broader education on principles and values of our Constitution. For example, it is probable that quite a few of us have migrant links in this room, because many of us, our great-grandparents, migrated from Lesotho, from Botswana, from Swaziland, from Mozambique to look for work in the mines. They worked here for 40 years. And because they were black and classed as not being citizens, they never received proper papers of citizenship, and thus were not properly administered in terms of migration policy. And today they bear the brunt of the negative sentiment that we sometimes refer to. I think crafting a framework that seeks to introduce more humane policy needs to begin by helping society understand the distinctions between refugee and migrant and illegal migrant. The three seem to be used interchangeably in our country. There are international laws that govern the receiving and treatment of refugees. We need to use them more effectively and consistently. And we need to distinguish between the management of refugee administration and that of other migrants. The issue of migrants, if treated properly and managed through clear policy, can be a benefit for a country in attracting skills and investments. I've seen it happen. For example, there are sectors in which we lack particular skills of engineering, civil or mechatronics or other sectors. If we had a clear migrant policy on skills, graduates in those areas would have ease of access to immigration administration. But we treat everybody in the same way, we don't have a clear distinctiveness, and so we make errors that could be of benefit, errors that could help us avoid losing benefits that would do well for our country. Any policy must actively respect the innate human dignity of every person who requires immigration services. I remember when I used to go to renew my residence permit as a refugee, you'll be received with such cold disdain in that country that the thought of going there the following year would make you want to return to South Africa, even under apartheid, even though you could be arrested. So we have to treat people much more humanely. Public officials responsible for the policy should be well trained and should be checked consistently for ethical practices. Prior to the finalization of any policy framework, extensive public consultation should be initiated to set out the facts and the reality linked to migration, and to secure broad public consensus on proposed policy. If we could build understanding, we might arrive at a basic consensus. We won't have total agreement, but at least we'll assure our citizenry that every effort is being made to craft a legal framework and to ensure it is executed efficiently. I think South Africa should be one of the most progressive countries on migration policy and on regional integration. After all, it is South Africans writing the Freedom Charter who proclaimed that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. There is worrying misinterpretation of this phrase of the Freedom Charter and its inclusion in the preamble of our Constitution. The assertion does not state that South Africa belongs to those who live in it illegally. In fact, the expectation of the writers of the Constitution, if you read the Constitution carefully, is that Parliament will develop legislation to give effect to all the rights. And as the Constitution states, laws may even be developed by our Parliament or be encouraged by the courts who would provide for the development of laws that give effect to the rights. So there is a procedure associated with the realization of the contents of the Bill of Rights. It doesn't ipso facto arise from the reference to a right. Again, effective administration of any of those laws as they're crafted would be absolutely necessary. These approaches will not be pursued if our governments, especially African governments, fail to respect and strengthen democracy, to strengthen freedom of association, to strengthen freedom of expression. The absence of these freedoms in many of our countries on the continent give rise to the movements that we see. Also, government public services and human development opportunities must be widely available to our populations and accessible to them. This is for the entire Africa, not just South Africa. A large proportion of migration on our continent is as a result of a decline in human rights standards, of low levels of democratic practice, of political intimidation in many of our countries, and inadequate public services. People know, if I move to country B, my children will have an opportunity to go to school. If I move to country C, I will have access to public health care. If I move to country Z, I will have access to infrastructure. And because my government is not providing any of those, I am going to move. Addressing all of these inadequacies is imperative for a humane migration framework. Governments of large African economies, I think, need to play a stronger development role in their regions to support industrial capacity development, infrastructure development, and employment creation in their partner countries. Economic islands, such as our big economies of South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, all of these need to accept a stronger role in regional integration and economic growth. We need to know where is the hub and what are the spokes in order to get us to the economic position we desire. So I hope in conclusion, I've given you some sense of how, if I were given the role, and I don't desire it at all, how I might shape a framework which is a humane migration policy, aware all the time of the constraints and of the emotion associated with the subject of migration. I do think that for those who are humane supporters of an improved framework, don't act in a manner that assumes all of us approach the issue with the same logic. Understand the emotion that exists and seek to interact with that emotion. We might achieve greater success if we approach the subject in that way. Thank you very much.